Mr. Oleg Baklanov, hello. Greetings to the hero of socialist labor and a prominent industrialist. I have just one question. How much profit was the Soviet Union making from selling Soviet defense products in 1991 when everything was already bursting at the seams? Approximately $20 billion a year from selling Soviet military hardware on the international market. How much were the Americans getting in 1991? The same amount, approximately. There was some parity between the two. What about in 1992, when Gaidar and Chubais came to power in Russia? We went down to $5 billion a year, but the Americans increased their sales to $35 billion. So we've heard those numbers from Oleg Baklanov, a well-respected man. In 1991, everything was shattering, but there was parity between the USSR and the USA in terms of arms sales. In 1992, when young reformers arrived, the sales tumbled down in just 1 year. That doesn't surprise me. We were not selling our arms only to the socialist camp. We had customers in the Middle East and India. The shipments on the majority of contracts that had been drawn up during the Soviet era were cancelled. So we do not know about all that nightmare that took place in the Russian defense industry during the privatization period.
Чья продукция продавалась, причем в лед шла на мировых рынках, мы всего кошмара не знаем. Это что касается продажи вооружений.
Yes, this is all about arms sales. We were working with all the countries, with America, European countries, with Japan, etc. All those countries were interested in developing their technologies.
И в 1991 году мы на Парижской выставке выставили
In 1991, we showcased 44 technological machine building systems in Paris, and we subsequently sold 100% of those systems. 22 enterprises were joint ventures. Their products would be sold to international markets. We sold the last of the machines in 1991. By 1992, everybody had left. Which industries were axed in the first place? Tool engineering was the first one to collapse. Electronics went next. We destroyed this huge potential entirely instead of investing in it. Machine building was the third industry to go. Can you explain why those young reformers were destroying such vitally important enterprises whose products were comparable to those of the US?
И шли живые деньги, не зачеты, как с Кубы или Эфиопии. В долг писали, да, продажа.
Why were those enterprises destroyed? Can't you understand why? I can't, really. In St. Petersburg, there was a remarkable enterprise of numerical control systems which was built in 1990. It was a brand new enterprise built in cooperation with Italy. All of a sudden, they started making cigarettes at that enterprise. When they were creating the concept for Russia, they did not even think about the technological development of that country. They wanted Russia to play the raw exports role only, with oil and gas. How could the idea have even entered their heads to start making Chinese bicycles at Simonov's legendary firm, which makes Sukhoi fighter jets? Someone wanted to do that. They would take the enterprises, the factories, and the money, and then just vanish. It's 2011 now, and this is the second part of our conversation about the price that one man had to pay to save the things that were left. I want to ask you the key question. There is no list of the enterprises that collapsed during the privatization. Who bought the strategic submarine-making factory in Komsomolsk-on-Amur? This is a question to Gennady Rykov. I've been to that enterprise. There are submarines sitting there and they are just docked. Nobody's doing anything with them. When Vladimir Putin started dealing with that factory, they couldn't find the owner at first. The owners were eventually found in New Zealand. Russia wanted to make that factory its state property, and the owners said that they wouldn't mind at all. How is it possible that a submarine-making enterprise was owned privately? Putin had to go there himself to look into everything that was going on. So it was a secret defense enterprise that was building nuclear-powered submarines, like the Kursk. There was one submarine with a nuclear reactor on board. It was 90% ready to work.
Завод секретный, где оборонка, где лодки, аналоги Курска. С атомным реактором, уже работающим на борту, была готовность 90%. То есть в любую секунду мог быть небольшой Чернобыль.
Yes, there was one submarine, the construction of which was nearly finished. The reactor was already active. The company was spending colossal amounts of money on production, a company which should have been controlled by the state.
На протяжении всех 90-х годов, Николай Александрович, всех 90-х, Виктор Иванович Ишаев, тогда еще губернатор...
Viktor Ishaev served as the governor of the Khabarovsk region during the 1990s. He said that he had to go to great lengths in order to get the factory back into the hands of the state. He tried to convince everybody in Moscow, all the ministers and everybody else, that cutting electricity in Komsomolsk-on-Amur was unacceptable. What would happen to the nuclear reactors on board those submarines? It would create a small Chernobyl, no more and no less than that. Why isn't there a list of the destroyed enterprises, not to mention the industries? There were whole industries which Putin managed to rescue from imminent decline. There is no such list, so we do not know what we have exactly lost, and nobody is interested in finding out. Industry as a whole was practically destroyed in Russia, unlike in the former Soviet bloc countries. They targeted the main technological institutes during privatization. Everybody used to be impressed by the speed of the USSR's technological development. Many foreigners would come to Russia to learn from the USSR.
Они приезжали к нам, все перехватывали. Отсюда и космос, ведь мы какую войну прошли, да? Так точно. Был железный занавес. Все сами сделали. Поняли руководители, что без своей технологии можно пыжиться сколько угодно.
When the USSR fell, the new Russian leaders were obliged by Western orders to deliberately destroy their own scientific factories and major industries, electronics, instrument making and machine building. It is a myth when they say that the Soviet Union did not have anything before its collapse. The country's GDP was in third place worldwide, and it was ranked second in terms of exports. A reform is an economic weapon which can be used to destroy economic entities. This is how it was described a long time ago in a book entitled Confessions of an Economic Hitman. This book was penned by an American working on one of those companies. He was investigating the subject of the economic destruction of whole nations. He described the way in which economic reforms could kill countries. You could use other kinds of weapons too. Food can be one of them. We do not really understand what kind of legacy Putin was dealing with. By the year 2000, Russia had completely lost the following: economic industry. Putin returned what he could. Shipbuilding. Civilian vessels first of all, which Putin managed to bring back. The industry of communication. Machine building, which Putin managed to bring back. Heavy machine building. Putin brought that too. Instrument making. Light industry. There was no Russian flax by the year 2000. The flax industry then reappeared in Kostroma and Ivanova. Putin received incredible credibility from people. He built the so-called vertical structure of power. How could it be that he could build that, but could not build other things? In the year 2000, it was already clear that Yeltsin was ruining everything. It was a slippery slope, and the country was derailing.
А можно нам с вами ответить?
I'd like to ask a question to Nobel Prize winner Joris Alfyorov.
Один вопрос. Если бы вот сегодня мы, Российская
If the Russian Federation had a goal today to build the A-bomb, would we be able to do that, as Stalin did after the war?
Сегодня, конечно, нет. Нет? Конечно, нет.
No, of course not.
Конечно, нет. Ну что вы?
A nuclear project, first and foremost, requires considerable spending. The Manhattan Project cost more than $2 billion, the dollars of the 1940s. Large-scale research in the nuclear field began in 1945 after Hiroshima, and then in 1949 it was ready. They managed to build the A-bomb in a record period of time.
И то, что в проекте удалось создать за предельно короткие сроки атомную промышленность.
So they built the A-bomb immediately after the war, in 4 years. Putin preserved the academic school in this field. By the year 2000, the school was literally on the brink of destruction. Putin changed the speed of the decline. The country was living under the administration of the predatory class, the oligarchs, who were devouring everything. Putin started creating problems for these oligarchs, but he could not get through to them and sway them in his favor. Was it Russia for capitalism, or capitalism for Russia? Putin could not change the people, of course, but he managed to change the country a lot. The oligarchs had gone too far before Putin arrived.
Рамазан Жанович, мы на секунду опять-таки сделаем паузу. В первой серии нашего фильма мы показали, Гейдар Алиев рассказывал о попытке...
Gaydar Aliyev told the story of the attempted assassination of Putin in Baku during his visit there. We didn't want to advertise ourselves, so we didn't say anything. The FSB knew that we had taken certain measures prior to Putin's arrival at Baku to prevent the attack. 2005 was a hard time for the National Security Ministry of Azerbaijan. That man, an Iraqi national, Kenan Ahmed Rustam, also known as Abdurrahman Bukhari and Abdul Said al-Kurdi, and Kenan Dastam, is also known under these aliases in the terrorist underworld. He was trained in Afghanistan and Chechnya. He subsequently waged war with the Chechens. It is hard to say when the plan to assassinate Putin was formulated. He had a whole arsenal of explosive devices. It was a complicated system made out of two parts: the transmitting and the exploding ones. Our specialists had not seen such systems before. They were not common among self-made bombs. How did they want to kill the Russian president? Those bombs were mobile phone-controlled bombs. They could be programmed via a signal from, let's say, Baku, which meant that you could detonate a bomb from any cellular network, which sends a signal there through the phone. When that report came out, some people wondered why I only discussed one assassination of Putin, if there were in fact 5 such attempts made. Putin's life was in danger 5 times.
Реальная опасность. Еще одна страница, точнее не одна страница, у нас сколько? 5 раз он рисковал своей жизнью. Эта тема закрыта. Почему? Вопрос остается без ответа.
This subject is closed, and there is no answer to the question of why. We're talking about the oligarchs, whom Putin did not manage to change. There was some man named Pumane. He was a bomber. He planted a car in a car near Kutuzovsky Avenue in Moscow. The bomb was so powerful it could have killed everybody in the vicinity and leveled the building nearby.
предполагаю покушение на Путина. Кто во
Who
главе
was the
Сената?
mastermind behind the
Да,
plot?
сенатор из мести был такой сенатор. Но это
A certain
как-то связано
senator was suspected of
с
this,
Башкирией, с
who might have
процессом
done it out of revenge.
деприватизации.
It was all linked to the Republic of Bashkiria and the deprivatization of the enterprises of the energy industry.
Моя вещь.
Pulmane had a weak heart.
Ударил Путин.
The police beat him
Пулмана
up.
сердечник был.
They hit him in the chest and he died.
По сердцу умер.
But that car had been prepared specifically for Putin. They were waiting for him.
А это башкирский ТЭК.
The Bashkirian energy industry found itself in private hands.
И когда
When Putin started to show an interest in the price for which the raw materials were sold and the income that the industry was accumulating, the assassins decided to prepare the car bomb for him.
вот они олигархи. Я не называю
I'm not
их.
giving any
Я
names.
журналист.
I'm only a journalist, and this is my version, but I believe that I'm right.
Кто? Вот привет из солнечной Башкирии, из города Уфы.
Bashkiria is not that important here. The interests of the large groups of oligarchs are much more relevant.
Второе, еще в большей степени это интересы многих за рубежом, которые не заинтересованы в усилении Путина.
Then there are also the interests of many people abroad who are not interested in Putin's activities. They're running a campaign now to completely overcome the consequences of the Soviet Union.
Советского Союза. Это чтобы ни по одному вопросу развития экономики и политики, социальной и культурной жизни.
The people who rule this world do not need Russia as a threat to their view of the economic, political, social, and cultural development of the world. Some say that Putin did not manage to get through to the oligarchs and change their minds. It meant that he still relied to a great extent on those oligarchs, which appeared under Yeltsin. And as a result of this dependence, those oligarchs became a lot richer. Putin did not make a fundamental change in the development of the country. That's what his duplicity is about, and people try to use that duplicity for their own gains. Russian citizens voted for capitalism in 1991. They elected Yeltsin, and they started moving in a capitalist direction. They tried to build capitalism in all its glory, but the reality is far from it. I don't agree with that. Putin changed the structure of Russia. People's lives do not depend on oligarchs anymore. This is what he did. During the 1990s, there was a quota system of officials, when each oligarch would have his own officials behind him. They had all kinds of officials. All the ministers had to do was maintain the business of their oligarchs.
Знаменитый план
There was that famous American plan to send hundreds of nuclear blows raining down upon the Soviet Union. They wanted to attack the cities, except for Moscow and St. Petersburg, where the large factories were located. There were over 300 cities on that list: Chelyabinsk, Rostov, and many others. Those young reformers were trying to destroy everything exactly as the Americans had planned, according to that list.
по этому списку. Вот такое совпадение. Совпадение, но именно такое. Молодые реформаторы с завода уничтожали.
The aircraft-making industry suffered from the same problems. Science was ruined. Afterwards, they started opening trade centres and entertainment complexes in scientific buildings. Many buildings were rented for offices. How could they arrange warehouses in unique scientific facilities in St. Petersburg? Did they know what they were doing? The factory with those unique facilities and the one next to it was acquired by some faculty. The factory with those unique facilities and the one next to it was acquired by some company called Chaika Plaza. That was absolutely right. The key word here is missiles. Russia has missiles now. We have Bulava, but we don't have any rubber. The rubber that used to be made for missiles and nuclear-powered submarines would have been made at Russia's only factory on the Volga River. That factory has been destroyed. They now make Bulava and Topol-M missiles. This is what Putin did. In 1992, the deputy director of Khrushchev's missile-making factory was trying to sell a defunct deactivated missile to a theme park in Australia. He was trying to make a profit and attempt to rescue his business. They had RS-56 missiles in their workshops at the factory. In Australia, there are some theme parks where you can visit a bunker and reenact the experience of a Soviet invasion. So the deputy director did manage to sell his defunct missiles in the end. Today, this enterprise is the leading one of its kind in Russia. Everything is working fine. However, in the past, the officials of the enterprise had to travel across the world to places like Australia to try and keep their company afloat. What was the need to amalgamate many factories into one conglomerate? Putin was trying to restore those companies, which the Americans had intended to destroy in their nuclear strike against Russia. As far as the West is concerned, Putin is the man who ousted the Western presence from within the former USSR's territory. As far as the West is concerned, Putin is the man who ousted the Western presence within the former USSR's territory. He became a problem for the New World Order. He became the person who destroyed the world, which appeared during Yeltsin's years. Igor Spassky, an academic, told us that one should never let the world become unipolar. We do not accept America's unipolarity, but practically, it is extremely hard for us today to create a second, equally important polarity in the world. However, the unipolar world is like one global state. When the West conduct propaganda in Russia, it is a part of their work in building the world order. Hillary Clinton clearly stated that Putin did not sanction the American invasion of Libya. In Libya, America could not do the things that it did in Iraq.
Которая уже подготовила тотальное уничтожение
Общественное мнение мировое, как с Хусейном.
I think it was during the 1950s that the Americans were going to bomb the Soviet Union. More than 300 nuclear strikes were supposed to be carried out against the USSR. They were talking about the Dulles Plan, but there was no Dulles Plan per se. There was a Chief of Staff's plan. They were special presidential directives, and the war was described there in detail.
Если мы возьмем список городов, которые должны быть уничтожены, и посмотрим, какие заводы Егор Тимурович уничтожил.
If we take America's list of cities that were supposed to be destroyed and see which enterprises were actually dissolved on the orders of former Russian Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, then it is clear that those two lists coincide completely. It was a method of economic murder. Gaidar was an economic hitman. Everything that started in 1991 was a plan to destroy Russia.
Вопрос, почему Гайдар и младореформаторы, знаменитый план американцев, как уничтожить ядерными зарядами Советский Союз. Более 300 городов. Те города, где были, правильно, заводы, прежде всего оборудование. 324 объекта. Именно по этому плану, в первую голову.
Now try to see what Putin has done. People don't talk about it much, but he prevented the further decline of the country. He halted those decisions that had been made to liquidate the country. I'd like to know why Gaidar and other reformers wanted to destroy the enterprises from that American list. There were 324 factories and cities on the list, and the Russian reformers destroyed about 200 of them. They did the things that the Americans had wanted to do, but they did not use any A-bombs for that. Putin brought half of those enterprises back to life. He pulled them out of ruin. But Putin managed to raise living standards so that people could survive. We were impoverished during the 1990s. Everybody says that Gaidar's reforms were harsh. What is the real price for the reforms in Russia during the 1990s? How many people died during those reforms? Tishkov, an academic, says around 2 million. His opponents, specialists on demography, say that there were around 11 million deaths. 11 million is a figure nearly twice as small as the losses that the USSR suffered during the Great Patriotic War. Now they say that 11 million was a number fabricated by patriotic demographers. Tishkov said that his number of 2 million deaths included the growth of the population with the help of immigration. However, the natural decline in the population never includes the growth through immigration. Reformers admit that Gaidar's new economic reforms resulted in the deaths of nearly 2 million people. We're talking about unborn children and those elderly people who died from money and food shortages. 2 million is comparable to the number of Pol Pot's victims in Kampuchea. But today we're talking about 12 million deaths. We do not count those who emigrated, although they should be referred to as losses as well. If there was such a huge number of people, why aren't we more aware of this? Is there any censorship that stops us from calling a spade a spade? This is the legacy that Putin received from Yeltsin. 1 million Russians were dying every year. There are 145 million Russians, which means that the Russians would become extinct as a race in 145 years. The death rate was higher than the birth rate. Who managed to raise the birth rate by 26%? Putin did that in 10 years, but we never discussed that. That is why I say he is the leader of the national revolution. He has not won yet, so it is a challenge. Don't forget that Yeltsin signed an agreement with Dudayev, the former president of Chechnya, about the separation of the Republic of Chechnya. The agreements that were signed in Chechnya marked the beginning of the collapse of Russia. I think that when Yeltsin was handing over power to Putin, he did not want to go down in history as Russia's last president at the country's demise. It was a miracle when the collapse of the nation was prevented, even though the collapse had already been predetermined.